What we're looking at tonight is citizenship in ancient Israel. And we're going to see how this contradicts some modern ideas. And we're going to be stepping perhaps on some toes regarding the Noahide Laws, because there are some ideas that are taught in modern Judaism today that really serve only to separate and to divide. So we're going to be looking at these ideas and seeing if they align with Torah or not. So the first thing we're going to look at, and let me just define what the concept of citizenship was in ancient Israel. In ancient Israel, what you find is that the idea of conversion and citizenship were really one and the same. To become an Israelite was to love Yehovah with all one's heart, mind, and soul. It didn't matter if you were a native-born citizen or whether you had immigrated to the land. That command was upon you to love God with all your heart. So you find that because Israel was a theocracy and they were a constitutional republic, these ideas were very much tied to each other. The other thing that you find is that the law really does not deal with people who live outside of the land of Israel. Israel was very much contained within the borders, and her theocracy, and it was a democracy as well, was very much concerned with living on the land. So it really didn't deal with people living in Assyria, Egypt, or Babylon, simply because they would not have been afforded a lot of the rights under the law to live law code. Now, why is that important? Israel's law code established justice. It established peace for the people within Israel's land. You know, people in Egypt would not have had that same type of freedom and liberty that Israel's citizens had. So that was very, very important. Some of the things that distinguish Israel from other nations was the Shabbat, giving a day off for all citizens. This was not a concept that other nations embraced. You also had other laws that established liberty and justice for all citizens, limited terms of indebtedness, debt relief for all citizens, a ban on usury. People living, even if they believed in Israel's God and they lived in other nations, it didn't matter. They could not have that liberty of living under those laws of liberty, simply because it was only established in Israel. Now, Egypt could always adapt. They could always adopt the Torah. Any nation could adopt the Torah, but the likelihood of that happening was not very great. Even in America today, a nation that is founded upon Judeo-Christian principles, where many of our laws and many of our values are come very, very close to Torah, we still don't follow it wholeheartedly. And this is why you find disparities among rich and poor, and among justice, among people that get away with heinous crimes over and over again, politicians even, versus the people that are living their lives and, you know, really suffer because they don't have that liberty equally across the board. So the idea that Torah is for the land comes by being able to establish this constitutional ideals, these ideals of justice within the land of Israel. And that is why the citizenship in the land is so important. If you look at America's founding fathers, they couldn't live out their beliefs. They couldn't live out their faith in Europe, whether it was Holland or the United Kingdom or France. You know, they were horribly persecuted. And even Jews throughout Europe, they could not live a Torah-based faith because, again, they were persecuted. So you really had to have a land, your own land, where you could establish a Torah-type constitution, and that is how you gained your freedom. So tonight, what we are going to be looking at specifically is the Torah based for the land of Israel, and what happened when people wanted to join Israel and wanted to join that Torah-based faith. So what we're going to look at, we're going to start with the classifications of citizenship. There are 5 classifications in Torah, and these are all given different names. Now, for those of us that have come out of a very English-based faith tradition, a lot of these names are lost. Even in Jewish translations, they're really not delineated. And so what we're going to look at tonight, we're going to go back to the Hebrew, and we're going to look at some of these translations and look at the original Hebrew wording so we can have a better understanding. So the first classification that you come across is the Israelite. The Israelite would have been an Israelite citizen. They would have been the descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They would have been a descendant of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and that would have been their lineage and their heritage. When you come to, some of the laws that YHWH gave to them was upholding the law. Again, God with all your heart, mind, and soul. You find that if you look at Leviticus 17:15, and I am on page 241 if you're following along in the book, there that states that every soul that eats an animal that dies of itself, or that which is torn with beast, whether it be one of your own country, an Ezrek is the Hebrew there, or whether it be a stranger, a ger, which would have been a convert, he shall both and bathe himself in water and be unclean until evening, then shall he be clean. So you find that there are the same kind of protocol as there is for the convert. There really is no distinction between ger and convert. Great to see you, Keith. Okay, Sylvia says the video is not great. I noticed that as well last week. I am noticing that on the video transmission, it is very poor quality, but if you go back and look at it during the week, the HD comes through and it's a better quality. I am not sure what's going on with that. I will try to email YouTube this week and see if we can get that glitch fixed, because we have not been having that problem in the past. I think it's just been the last 2 weeks. All right, going on. So an Ezrek is a person that is an Israelite. They were descended from Jacob. They inherited the land. Their forefathers inherited the land under Moses. They were granted arable lands when the land was allotted and divided. And then they've grown up in those heritages. They've inherited them for generations upon generations. Sometimes, 15, 20 generations have lived on that same plot of land. So very much being tied to your family history, being tied to the heritage of your nation and the history of your nation. So it's very oriented in your national ideology, in your patriotism, and your allegiance to YHWH and his law. He is the God that brought you up out of Egypt, delivered you from the house of bondage, and gave you this Torah to live by, this constitution, so that you can be truly free. When we get the second classification of citizenship is the Nakar or Nakori. Both terms are used interchangeably to refer to the same group class of people. I just want to welcome both Keith and Deborah. Great to have you both with us. Nice to have you along this evening. So you find that Nakar is somebody from another nation. They could have been a Canaanite, they could be an Ammonite, an Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian. They were a non-Israelite. Their heritage in no way tied to Abraham. It did not tie to Jacob or any of the 12 tribes. They were a separate person. Beyond this, the Nakar did not really have any desire to be a part of Israel. We could perhaps compare this to modern Americans, modern French, Europeans who are really just happy living in their own nations, have no desire to live by Torah's constitution or to join themselves to YHWH's people. They're happy being in their own country and their own nation. Genesis 17:12 has a stipulation for these people. It says, and this was when Abraham, if he bought a person that was in a car, a foreigner, if he bought him with money, that person was still required to be circumcised, even though he may not pledge allegiance to Israel's God. So this is kind of an interesting thought regarding this particular custom. And this is again is Genesis 17:12. It says, "And he that is 8 days shall be circumcised among you, every man child throughout your generation. He that is born in your house or bought with money of any of the stranger," and the word there for stranger is Nakar, "which is not of your seed." So if an Israelite purchased a Nakar, a foreigner, a Canaanite, an Ammonite, a Moabite, it didn't matter. If they purchased a foreigner as a slave, they were to become circumcised when they entered your home. Now, a Nakar that was not part of your home, that were that slave system, that just lived in your land as a resident alien or something like that, he was not compelled to be circumcised in any way. None of the laws really applied to him, except for the fact that while he was on Israel's land, he was to abide by the laws of the land like we would in any nations today. You go to Germany, you really have to abide by German laws. You come to America, you're going to have to abide by America's laws. You kill somebody, there is going to be consequence. You commit a theft, there will be a consequence that is stipulated by the laws of the land and the court system that is in place during that day. So that that ideology still holds true, even though they are not commanded or required in any way to live by Israel's ceremonial law. So the Nakori would not keep the holy days, and Nakar would not be required to be circumcised if they were not a slave. A Nakar would not be required to keep the clean laws or really anything else in Torah that was outside of the realm of social justice. Social justice, again, would still be binding on the Nakar as long as he was with, simply because that is naturally how a society functions. So back to the idea of the difference between an Israelite, which would have been a native-born Israelite who obeyed Torah, and the Nakar, who was somebody who had no interest in joining Israel. There were certain things Israelites were allowed to do. In Exodus 12:43, we find that the Nakar was forbidden to eat the Passover. None of his animals were suitable for sacrifices. That's Leviticus 22:25. Israelites could charge him interest. You know, Israelites could not charge interest of their own citizens, but they could of the Nakar. They could also, and that was Deuteronomy 23:20. And then again in Deuteronomy 14:22, we find the right of natural death could be sold to him for consumption. So there were some distinctions between the Nakar and the Israelite. But as we will see, those same distinctions did not exist between the Israelite, meaning the native-born citizen, and the Ger. That was someone who would have joined in affinity to Israel, would have cleaved to Israel's God, wanted to follow Israel's law, the Torah, and wanted to be part of the congregation. As we're going to see, that is a total that has really been, I would say, misrepresented over the last 2,000 years. So we'll get into that in a minute. We want to look at some of these other classifications before we get to the beloved Ger. Other classification, this is the third classification, is the Tsar. The Tsar is more of an adjective. It is something that demonstrates not only a person that is alien to God, a foreigner, but somebody who almost has a hatred towards Torah or to God's people. Psalms 58:3, David says, "The wicked are estranged, they are Zur from the womb. They go astray as soon as they be born, speaking lies." The concept here is that the wicked have no instruction of Torah. They have no knowledge of Torah. So naturally born, you know, throughout the woman's pregnancy, she would have eaten pork, would have been unclean. Perhaps, you know, even before this, there would have been other impurities, you know, sex during menstruation, which would have meant a higher risk of cancer. Perhaps they were not monogamous, which again would have increased risk of sexually transmitted diseases, as we saw in chapter 6 and chapter 5. So all of these things, Nakar up for having being disadvantaged at birth. And when they were born, they really would not have followed any Torah. So from the point that they were born, they and their families really did depart from the way of YHWH, in that there was no upon them in any way to obey it, because they were part of a different nation, a different society. You also find that even within Israelite citizenry, there is this idea that even Israelites could become Zur. They could become Zurim, where Torah and Yahweh was concerned. And that is the idea that they have departed from the way of Yahweh. They have rebelled. They have committed a heinous crime, whether it was rebelling against the Shabbat. Maybe they would have sold something on the Shabbat, and started a trend. Maybe adultery. They did something that was very grievous under the eyes of the law, and that made them Zurim. Now, the difference with this, and how you see this expressed throughout Torah, is in the phrase that they would be Israel. Now, a lot of people say, oh, being cut off to Israel, that was the death penalty. It actually wasn't. What you find when you kind of put all the pieces of the puzzle together is that these people, rather than being executed, and that was indeed an option in very grievous cases, but more often than not, if they rebelled against Torah, what they lost by being cut off from the congregation of Israel was their right to vote. They lost their voting right in Israel's congressional assembly. In our next class, played a very rich and important part of Israel's judicial society, both in their legislature as well as in their judiciary. And we're going to, again, see that even more next week. Continue the idea of constitution and Torah. Tonight, with the idea of citizenship, there wasn't just this blanket, blank check where Israelites could do whatever they wanted without consequence. Being the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did not mean that they could ignore the law and still retain all of the rights that they were born with. They retained their arable lands, even if they sinned. Their children retained those lands. But it was possible for a father, not necessarily affect the children, but if the father rebelled, he could lose his right to vote in congregation. So that was what separated the Zur, the estranged person in Israel, from Israel's righteous congregation. The fourth category of citizenship that we find in Israel is the Tashab. Now, the Tashab would have been a working resident alien. A lot of times they're really associated with debt slavery. They are sold to an Israelite to repay their own debts back in their home country, oftentimes. Other times, they come to Israel seeking better employment. Perhaps there's a poor economy at home, and they come to Israel seeking employment. So they're the status of a resident alien. In the United States, what we perhaps have traditionally called wetbacks, or people from Mexico that come seeking temporary resident status for the purpose of earning an income, sending those wages back home, because what you're going to make in America is going to be a higher wage that you can send back home to your relatives to and help them out. You find that same idea in Israel with the Tashab. Now, the Tashab is another class like the Nakar that has no really desire to join Israel's society. They don't want citizenship, to join to Israel's laws. They don't want to be bound by Israel's laws. They're simply there to make a living. So you find that in Exodus 12, verse 45, that the Tashab, which is translated foreigner right there in most translations, is prohibited from eating of the Passover sacrifice. Now, why is the Passover so important? And why is the Passover? You see throughout Israel's history, throughout all of the statutes and commands, that it is this Passover taking of it that really makes a person an Israelite. So why is that ceremony so important? What you find in ancient covenants, every covenant was sealed by something. You have the circumcision covenant is sealed by the act of circumcising. You have the promised land covenant that is sealed with this divided sacrifice. You have the burnt offering covenant. And guys, if this is kind of going over your head, come between Genesis 12 and about Genesis 24 is where most of these covenants are found. I cover them in detail in chapter 3, but there are very specific covenants that promise very specific things. And what you find is that in the burnt offering, and then again in the national covenant offered in Exodus, that it is usually sealed with a sacrifice. And what you would typically do is you would take an oath with this sacrifice, and you would state that if I and my children do not uphold all the words of this covenant to do them, what happens to this animal as you slit its throat or you offer it as a burnt offering, may that what happens to this animal happen to me and my children, my descendants, if we do not uphold all the words of this covenant to do them. So that is what we find the significance of the Passover sacrifice was. It was a national covenant. So then when we look in Israel's history, and when we look thousands of years into the temple era and the Roman era, and we see all of this incredible bloodshed and these horrific events that occur in Judah and Israel's future, you know, all of these are consequences for violating the covenant, is for not turning from their ways and returning to the law. So the Nakar, or just simply a resident alien, he's a hireling, who has no desire to be joined to this covenant, to accept that huge responsibility, to accept that identity and that fate for your children if you disobey. You know, he doesn't have to be bound by it. There's no compulsion there. But at the same time, by not obeying it, by not living under Israel's righteous government, he's not going to have the same liberty. He won't have the same prosperity that you're going to have by living in a righteous nation. So it really is a given trade, a trade within that. Something else that's interesting that I think a lot of people who approach the Torah under a more religious context often miss. There's a lot of controversy regarding the Shabbat, the Sabbath. And there have been claims made that the Sabbath is only for the Jews. And even today, you will find that Jews will hire Nakari to do their Sabbath labor for them, whether it's turning on a light, which they consider to be work, whether it's doing something more manual and more physical labor. You find that that is an accepted custom today. However, it violates Torah, and this is where. In Leviticus 25, verse 6, it states, "And the Sabbath of the land shall be meat for you, for your servant, and for your maid, and for your hired servant, and for the Tashab that sojourns among you." So you find that even the Tashab, this resident alien who had no desire to join Israel's society, to be a part of Israel's community, even they were afforded the protection, the liberty under the law of having a day off from hard physical labor. You know, I don't think that a lot of us today can really appreciate the incredible labor and intensive labor that they did back then. You know, today we have vacuum cleaners that do our work for us. We have cars that take us places. We have tractors that plow our fields for us. All of that was done manually back then. And it would have been very grinding, grueling work. As a matter of fact, we know that the average lifespan of a person was about 45 or 50 years of age due to the hard and demanding work that you lived. And 45, 50 was really more of an upper class citizen. Lower class citizens who worked harder, you know, you may have only lived to maybe 35 or 40 years of age. And that was considered a very full life to have led that long. So the idea that the Shabbat, that the Sabbath is for your employee, It is for the foreigner. You know, it's for the Syrian refugee. It's for the Mexican worker. It's for all of these people that come into your land seeking asylum. Now, as we are going to see, the Torah did not just offer them land, free land. The only people that could come into Israel's society were really only those that could find employment with a Torah family, you know, with one of the Estranged, or they had to be able to make it within a city. So there were very much strong protections there for the native-born citizens, but there was a lot of latitude and a lot of freedom for them and join Israel's society. So continuing on, you find that in Leviticus 25, and we're going to come back to this again with me to Leviticus 25, verses 35 through 37. States, and if your brother is wax poor and falls into decay with you, then you shall relieve him. A stranger, and the word here for stranger is ger, which would have been a convert, or a sojourner, which would be a tashab, that he may live with you. Take no usury of him or increase, but fear Jehovah your God. For your brother may live with you. You shall not give him your money on usury, nor lend to your victuals to him on increase. So right here, we find that the Tashab and the ger. Now again, the ger would have assimilated with Israel. The ger would have joined the society of Israel and wanted to be part of that nation. It didn't matter which one. They could not be charged. Israel could not charge usury of them or take advantage of them in any way. The only type classification that Israel could charge usury was the Nakar, who was a and wanted really no part of Israel's law or Israel's society. So now we come to the fifth classification, which is the favorite by far for this discussion, and this is the beloved ger. You find that the beloved ger was eligible to eat at the Passover sacrifice. In Exodus 12, 48 and 49, it says, when a stranger that sojourn with you will keep the Passover of Yahovah, let all his males be circumcised, then let him come near, and he shall be as one that is born in the land. That means that he's the same as an Estranged. He is the same as a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Under the law, there is no distinction. He is an Israelite. It says, for no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. One law shall be to you that is homeborn, and the stranger that is among you. So again, this idea of one law, one God, an Akkad law, an Akkad God. The idea that there is no duality, but there is one, and it is in that oneness that there is unity for the land. And this unity comes through a national constitution that provides liberty and justice for the entire nation, whether a sojourner, whether a foreigner, or whether someone who wants to come and become part of the nation of Israel. Now, you find, and let's bring in some of the historical reality here. You find that, and I'm going to look through some of my notes here, because before I was just looking at the text. You find that the Tashab was, you know, he was afforded a lot of rights that I would say a lot of religious ideologies really don't accept today. The idea that the Tashab should have the Shabbat off, that contradicts a lot of the Noahide laws. You know, the Noahide laws states that you be a ger or a foreigner, there's no compulsion to keep the Shabbat. And another thing that you find, you know, the ger becomes the same as an Estranged. There's an equality under the law. But even more than that, you know, in ancient times, your immigrants were very much oppressed. If you immigrated from Babylon to, say, Elam, or from Babylon, Turkey, to where, you know, the Hittites had been, immigrants in ancient times became a slave class. They had no rights. And I think to put this into perspective that we can relate to, when you remember under Roman times, only Roman citizens had rights under the law. If you were a Jew or you were an Ebionite or something from another culture or nation, and you were not a Roman citizen, you were not granted the same rights to justice under the law that Roman citizens. Well, this was the same universally throughout all pagan nations. Only your citizens had rights under the law. The Torah changed this. The Torah established this entirely new paradigm that everyone was equal under the law. Not everyone was compelled to obey it, but if you are in Israel's lands, you are afforded the same rights of justice, no matter what nation you came, citizen, ger, and Nakar. The difference was in your obedience to Torah and your commitment to that nationality and to becoming a citizen within the land of Israel. Now, there is a distinction within Israel between Nakars and ger. Let me grab a glass of water here. And that came down to voting rights. And this, again, is something that we're going to look at in depth in our next class. And that is the only people in ancient Israel society that could vote in what would be equivalent to the Senate or the Congress would be those that owned arable lands in the countryside. These would be families that were income producing estates that had lived on the land for thousands of years, hundreds of years during the Judges era. But you find that these were the people that were eligible to vote in Israel's congressional assemblies. And as we will see, for very good reason. So when a ger came into the land, and he would often work for one of Israel's income producing estates, but he didn't gain land. That means he did not have a right to vote. He could go to the temple. He could offer sacrifices. He could keep the Shabbat. He could keep all the ceremonial laws and be grafted in, be part of Israel. He still could not vote politically. The only way that a ger could obtain the right to vote occurred one of at least two ways. Number one, the man would have to marry within an Israelite's house, marry a daughter. The father would have to be willing to give that man, love him, an inheritance within his land. So in other words, sons, or maybe he had no sons, this man, this ger, would actually become an heir of his estate. Maybe not the entire estate, but at least one portion of it. He would then be reckoned, his genealogy would be reckoned according to his wife's father's house. And we actually have an example of this in the book of Jeremiah where it is referred to. So this was a custom that was very much acceptable. But by doing this in the third generation, this man's children became eligible to vote in Israel's congressional assemblies. And so then they gained that right. It wasn't all of a sudden. It wasn't in one or two generations. It was in the third generation. And God did this in order to protect Israel's citizenry from subversive means. If you look at the Second Temple period, where you had Sanballat the Horite, who comes in and he tries to subvert Israel's sovereignty. He tries to subvert Israel's solidarity and its strength, and totally sabotages the nation in every way. Had the Second Temple Jews during that period been observing these commands within the law, that subversion would not have taken place, because he would not have been allowed a voice within Israel's communities, within their governing body. His influence would have been totally mitigated. So you find that there's a lot of protection for Israel's citizens. And by protecting Israel's citizens, it secondly, as say a trickle down, naturally protects the ger, because if there is not a strong Israel, there really is no strength for the ger to seek to within the nation of Israel. We also find that beyond becoming a part of Israel, that the law establishes rights and privileges for the ger. Because the ger does not have arable lands, because he is disadvantaged, Yehovah makes up for it in other ways. He has provided sustenance through the welfare system. And let's look at some of the laws that establish this. And we're going to kind of jump around here a little bit. I'm going to be, for those of you following along in the book, I'm on page 246. If you look at Deuteronomy 14:28 through 29, it says, at the end of 3 years, you shall bring forth the tithe of your increase in the same year in your gates. And the Levite, because he has no part of an inheritance with you, and for the ger, the fatherless and the widow, which are within your gates, shall come and eat and be satisfied, that Yahweh your God may bless you in all the works of the hands that you do. So you find that this 10% tithe sustenance of at least 3 people, 3 groups of people, classifications. The Levites, which would have been your government workers who had no income producing estates. They would have had small plots of land, but nothing by which they could really earn a living. You offer the fatherless and the widow who did not have a male provider in the home that could go out and work fields and earn an income to help support his family. So the fatherless and the widow. And thirdly, the ger, who again did not have access to those arable lands that were income producing estates. So the law compensated for this by offering him income, subsistence, through this 10% that was divided among the different classifications. Again, in Psalms 146, verse 9, David says, Yahweh preserves the gers, he relieves the fatherless and widows, but the way of the wicked he turns upside down. So again, the idea that gers protected citizenship. Turn to Leviticus 19:10. It says, and you shall not glean your vineyard, neither shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the ger. I am Yahweh your God. So again, God establishes abilities for the ger to compensate for the fact that he does not have arable land. In Leviticus 23:22, Israel is commanded to only glean their field once. If they leave a sheaf, they have extra gleanings. Don't re-glean it. Allow the ger to come in. Allow him to glean. He can either sell his what he gathers. He can sell it for income, or he can use it for sustenance. Then turn to Leviticus 24:18. And we're going to begin right around the middle of verse 18. It says, when you cut down your harvest in your field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, you shall not go again and fetch it. It shall be for the ger and for the fatherless and the widow, that Jehovah may bless you in all the works. For when you beat your olive, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the ger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. So again, you find all these provisions in the law that are for the ger. They're for the sustenance, something to compensate for the fact that they do not have arable lands. So in every way, we find that God has all these protections for people that establishes an equity within the land. The other thing that we find, and this is very, very, very interesting, and I'm going to find this because, okay, turn with me, if you will, to Exodus 12:19. And this is where I believe the ideas of the Noahide laws just really totally fall apart. If you turn with me to Exodus 12:19, it states, 7 days there shall be no leavened bread found in your houses. For whoever eats that which is leavened, even that soul shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he be a ger or a native-born citizen, an Israelite. There is no difference between a convert and a native-born citizen. They are one and the same. A ger is cut off from the congregation of Israel if he or she does not observe this holy day. Gers are compelled to observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, a high holiday within Israel. So this separation between Israel, people that are born to the seed of Jacob, and the ger are totally unfounded. Under the law, they are one and the same, and they are commanded to obey one law. Turn with me to Deuteronomy 26, verses 11 through 13. In here, Moses says, and you shall do a good thing which Yahweh your God has given to you, and to your house, and to you the Levite, and the ger, the stranger that is among you. And when you have made an end of your tithing, all your tithes have increased in the 3rd year, which is the year of tithing, shall be given to the Levite, the ger, the fatherless, and the widow, that they may go well with you. So again, there's this idea that there's one law and there's one constitution, no matter who you are. Everyone is united in Israel. To be cut off from Israel would have meant that you to vote. For a man who is seeking to graft himself into Israel, it would have meant that his generation would not have been eligible for consideration for that 3-generation ban. It was that in the 3rd generation, his children could come into the congregation and they could have voting rights. And we're going to see that next week when we get into the Adah and the Kahal, when we see how those legislative bodies worked within Israel's society. Exactly, Stephen, there was no double standard in Israel's law. It was very much one and the same. Turn with me to Numbers 15, 14 through 16. I don't think any verse makes it more clear than this one. It says, if a stranger, a ger, sojourn with you, for whoever you in your generations, and will offer an offering made by fire or a sweet savor to Yahovah, as you do, so shall he do. So here he's talking about as you do, as the Israelites do, as the do, so you shall do. One ordinance shall be both for you and the congregation, and also for the stranger, the ger, that sojourns with you. One ordinance forever in your generations. As you are, so shall the ger be before Yahovah. There's no separation. There is no distinction in Yahovah's eyes between a Babylonian and an Israelite, or an Assyrian and as an Israelite. If they are coming together to join the same people, to join the same constitution, and have a love for Yahovah, and want to be a part of that liberty, and they are committed to upholding that standard of liberty, they are one and the same under the eyes of the law. There is no separate law of the ger. Now, one thing that you hear when you hear Noahide laws being talked about, or the law of the ger as well, people will use the stipulation in Torah that allows the Israelites to not only sell an animal that died of itself, but to charge interest. But they miss a very important point, and let's go look at it. So turn with me to Deuteronomy 14:21. And it says, you shall not eat anything that dies of itself. You shall give it to the ger that is in your gates, that he may eat of it, or you may sell it to an alien, a Nakar. That is Deuteronomy 14:21. So again, Israel is allowed to sell animals that died of itself to a ger, a convert, or to Nakar. Now the idea here is that the whether it be the Nakar or the ger, they are so impoverished, they are hungry, that they will actually consider eating a dead or sick animal. But notice what the stipulation in Torah is if you commit this sin or this crime under the law. Turn to Leviticus 17:15. It says, and every soul that eats that which died of itself, or that which was torn in pieces by beasts, whether it be one of your own country or a ger, he shall both wash his clothes and bathe himself with water and be clean in the even. Then shall he be clean. The statute, the way of becoming clean, was the same for an Israelite as it was for a convert, a ger. There was no distinction in the law between the two classifications. So if you were an Israelite and you sinned by eating a beast that died of itself, say you were so impoverished, your family was hungry, maybe there was famine in the land, and you were willing to take that chance to eat that carcass, and you had sinned by it, the way for becoming clean and right with God was the same for you as it was for a ger. There was no double standard. There was no separate law of the ger. It was the same. It was a universal law. It provided incredible unity because everyone was equal under the law. You also find that throughout the prophets, as Israel's history progresses, that the prophets are always chastising Israel for trying to have this double standard. They try to put themselves up on a pedestal. They try to make the law only for them. Isaiah 65:5 says, you know, you say, get away from me because we are holier than thou. And the prophets really come down hard on Israel for doing this. Look at Ezekiel 22, verse 7, and again, 29 through 30. Ezekiel says, in the midst of you, you have dealt by oppression with the ger, the stranger. Yes, they have oppressed the stranger, the ger, wrongfully. And I sought a man among them that should make up the hedge and stand in the gap before me for the land, that I should not destroy it. And I found none. What you find is that even though Israel was prohibited from charging interest to the ger, Israel saw an opportunity and they took it. They charged interest of the ger, even though the law specifically forbade it. The only people Israel could charge interest of, again, were the Nakar, people that were not Israelites, had no intention of joining Israel. It would be the same as the United States making loans to Mexico, or people in the United States making loans to foreigners from Russia or from Japan or something like that. You know, there's no effect on your society. But again, there is the singleness of Israel's law, the oneness, the akkad of Israel's law. And this is what I find is just so compelling, and it provides such a love for the law, because you see the love that God has for justice and righteousness, and that it is not confined to one group of people. If you obey it, you will naturally have the blessing, where if you disobey it, you will not have those particular. Now, Stephen says, somewhere there is also a verse that says you may not even remind the ger that he was not an Israelite. Very, very true. You know, God provided so many protections for the ger that was unprecedented in any society. This idea that a person from a foreign land could be equal to you was a totally new concept that no other nation, ancient nation, embraced. So this is something where we see the Torah totally departs from Hammurabi's code. It departs from Egyptian laws and common laws that existed as late as the Roman era. We also find, let's look at this again, because just to drive home the point about usury. And again, this is Deuteronomy 23, 19 through 20. It says, you shall not lend to usury to your brother, usury of money, usury of victuals, usury of anything that is lent on usury, to a Nakar lend on usury, but your brother you shall not lend, that Yahweh your God may bless you in the land where you go. And then there are promises that we find throughout Torah of restoration of the ger being restored in Israel's latter day redemption and being seen equally under the law. And this time Israel actually gets it. They stop this division and this separating and this, you know, you're on the class on the right and we're on the class. I call it the Sneetches on the Beaches complex. And for those of you who have ever read Dr. Seuss or might be interested in following up on this, if you go to YouTube and just type in Dr. Seuss Sneetches, Sneetches, Sneetches on the Beaches, it's a 5 parody, but it really sums up what so many people try to do in creating an elite class of citizenry, where we separate between I've got, you know, I have the truth, or I have the pedigree, the lineage, or I have whatever it is you have, where you try to separate, divide, conquer, and really sow division and strife is ultimately what it does. So when you get rid of that complex and you realize that we are all equal, that there is only one law that benefits everyone equally if it is followed, there is no room for pride. There is no room for lifting yourself up above anyone else, because we are all the same. But yet we all have the same incredible potential to do so much, to establish such liberty and claim that hope that is given to us in the scripture. So look at Isaiah 14, verse 1. Here Isaiah says, "For Yahweh will have mercy on Jacob, and yet choose Israel, and set them in their own land, and the Gers shall be joined with them, and they will cleave to the house of Jacob." So we find again that there is this promise of latter-day restoration. But, modernly, we still find that religious sects still want to divide. They want to add to Torah by providing or requiring provisions for conversion that are not there. There are even some within religious sects that claim that converts are not allowed to observe Torah. They're not allowed to keep Shabbat. They're not allowed to keep the holy days. They're not allowed to obey all the 10 commandments, and almost as though obeying Torah is somehow sinful for if you are a ger or if you're a non-Israelite. That is absolute hogwash. Follow Torah, don't follow men, return to the text. It is your life. It will give you such hope and such joy, and it will strengthen you in the future, and you can cleave, you can become part of this promised latter-day remnant that is promised throughout Scripture. I'm going to close with Ezekiel 47, verses 21 through 23. And here Ezekiel says, "So shall you divide the land to you according to the tribes of Israel." This is talking about the latter-day restoration. "And it shall come to pass that you shall divide it by lot an inheritance among you. To the heirs that serve, which shall beget children among you, and they shall be to you as one born among the children of Israel. They shall have an inheritance with you among the tribes of Israel." This is an amazing concept. We find that with Israel's first Canaan conquest, when they first came into the land, there were many foreigners that had escaped Egypt with them. And these foreigners came into Canaan with Israel. They were grafted into Israel, and they were given equal inheritances at that time. Joshua the Kenite is a prime example. His lineage did not trace to Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. He was a Kenite, one of the nations that in Genesis 12 says is to be driven out of the land. But because Joshua joined the children of Israel, he loved Jehovah and he was zealous for God, he is given an equal, and it's like Joshua within the land of Israel. And because he joined God, this ger is established in Israel's land. The same too at Israel's latter-day restoration, where God says that the land will be divided equally among all of those that join to Israel and to Israel's God by covenant. So this is a lot of hope and a lot of reassurance. I hope I've kind of challenged some of your preconceived ideas, and I really want to encourage you, return to the text, see what scripture says, and don't just assume that because some person who has a title by their name or who may have done years and years of research or who have traditions thousands of years old doesn't make it right. If it contradicts the written word of Torah, then it contradicts. It doesn't matter where you come from. If God is a God of truth, he does not change. His law is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And it is in that law that we can find unity, hope, and freedom today and for the future. So Shabbat Shalom. I'm going to close with that. And I'm going to open it up for any questions that you guys have. Now, let me just say, we will not have class next week, which will be January 1st. I will my son's Eagle Scout ceremony next Sunday, so we will skip next week. But we will meet again on, let's see, what is this going to be? Let me go to my, we will meet again on the 8th. So I will post this to the websites So that way you guys have it. But we will not meet next week, but we will meet again on the 8th will be our next class. So, oh, Cindy, I am so glad you're able to get on to chat. Great to see you guys here. And, oh, I'm great that it's right in line. So any questions or comments, anything you want to add, or something else that you've seen in the text? Our next class, that way you know, we're going to be covering pages 251 to, let's just go, I'm either going to, I don't know, I'm going to either cut it off at page 258 or go all the way through page, let's see, if I keep going, it's going to be a lot longer. It's going to go, I think I'm going to cut it at 258. So again, it's a really short read for next week. It exists 2 pages, volume 1, page 251 to 258. And the reason I'm doing this is because we are going to get into Torah Constitution and United States Constitution. And this is so much fun because we are going to see just how close the United States Constitution is to Torah and why it is a land filled with such liberty. So this becomes a lot of fun when you see the compatibility. Now, Betty says, I've heard that those coming out of Egypt were about 10% Hebrews. Do you know anything about this? You know, I don't know. I would imagine that the Torah narrative, the concept, you know, everything is set there for the Hebrews. And if the Hebrews were a minority, I think it would be very hard for YHWH to establish this paradigm based on, you know, your Hebrew slaves or your Hebrew. There were probably, they were strangers that joined them, but I do believe that the vast majority, you know, it says over 600,000 men were Hebrews. I don't think that that the amount, I would say that the number of, and these would have been converts, these would have been more refugees that were just seeking asylum that immigrated out of Egypt or fled Egypt with Israel, was probably more of a 10, maybe 15% of that group of people. The rest, you know, they really could have fled in other ways. We do know, and again, for those of you that may not be familiar with it, I placed the date of the Exodus at 1548, right with the Hyksos explosion out of Egypt, where we know that a lot of the Hyksos indeed fled to Canaan, to the southern city of Shurhuin, and eventually Moses seized it for a number of years. And you know, he may have slaughtered everyone, they may have escaped, we really don't know. We do know that the city fell, but it is possible because we know that most of the Hyksos were indeed Canaanites or Assyrians, some sort of assimilation between the two. Many of those people may have fled by other means, and not all of them would have escaped with Israel to Mount Sinai, or they would have fled in the desert by other means. Joy says, I wonder who says that only 10% of the Hebrews came out of Egypt in the Exodus, and what is this based on? Yeah, I would be very interested to know that as well, because I have not seen that. Yeah, Betty, I would really think that I wouldn't say that 90% of the Hebrews stayed in Egypt. I think 90% of the people that came out of the Egypt were Hebrews, and 10% of the people that came out of Egypt with the Hebrews were of other nationalities, probably Nubians, Kenites, oppressed people throughout Canaan. We know that Egyptian pharaohs during this time period would go into Canaan. They would raid villages, and they would gather slaves from those villages and bring them back to Egypt, enslave them. So a lot of these people were probably Canaanites that escaped with Israel. Some of them would have been Gers, but at that point in time, you know, there may have been some that did not want to join the covenant of YHWH. So those people would have remained Nakars, and at some point in time, they probably would have separated from the children of Israel, whether it would be in the wilderness or at some point in time, and have gone on the merry way. Just because the text doesn't, the text is limited, it refers to Israel's history and is really only concerned with the history of Israel. So there's a lot of things that we're not told that may have happened. So glad you're enjoying the class. Some of the sabbatical years should be also kept outside the land of Israel. Any comments? This is a great question. For me, borrow a term from Joshua, as for me and my house, I would say yes. The blessings of following the land to rest, are the same whether you're within the land of Israel or not. What we know from Scripture, the animals are specifically commanded to be allowed into the field and to pasture into that field that is allowed to lay fallow. Well, what we know agriculturally is that when animals go into a field, they leave remains. Those remains enrich the soil. You might add a cover crop to the land that also enriches the soil that you plow under. You don't harvest it. So all those nutrients are being reinvested in the land. So yes, it is universal. One of the things that I argue throughout Yahweh exists is the idea that the derek, the way of Yahovah, is predicated on natural law. In other words, God has taken physics, whether it be the laws of thermodynamics, Newton's second law of motions, the laws of entropy. He's taken all of these laws by which creation and by which our universe works, and he's given it to us in a moral code, in a code of living, a code of righteous governance, of how to have equity between man and between man and government, between man and God. And by doing this, it's universal, whether justice works the same in Israel or the United States, the UK, Saudi Arabia. It doesn't matter where you live. Justice is justice. Women's rights are the same. Oppressing women is the same in Saudi Arabia as it is America. Just because you live in one place does not mean that those rights are not inherent and they are not God-given. They still exist whether you acknowledge them or not. I'm so glad you guys are enjoying this. Raylene says, this was so exciting. Thank you. I think some of the confusion in reading the verses in English is what we had no idea of the different names for stranger. Exactly right. And I will say this, that even the Jewish translations, whether you go to the JPS Society, whether you go to most of your Jewish translations do not acknowledge those differences even within the text. So it is something that I would really recommend. Get a good Bible program. And let me just say this too, I will be teaching on January 6th, and my class for that day is going to be how to study Scripture. We're going to kind of get into the nitty-gritty. I'm going to give you guys some, hopefully, just enliven your study and allow you to know God for yourself without having to have any intermediary, and you can have that close relationship and understand Torah for yourself. Stephen says, one Cohen we know says Israel depends, is outside of the land, still growing crops that year, but Torah says Yahweh will provide in advance for the Shemitah year. Exactly. What you find in Torah is this idea that during the years of plenty, Israel is supposed to have grain houses, and they are supposed to set aside their granary, their produce for those years, and they're supposed to save up so that it will sustain throughout those years. Most nations today are kind of greedy, where they just want to sell everything and have the proceeds. Torah teaches you to sell some and set some aside. So, okay, great. Oh, thank you so much, Sue. And thank you guys so much. I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow morning at Roots of Faith, 10:30 Central. I will be posting for those of you who are new to Roots of Faith, I'll be posting a link tomorrow morning on my webpage. And I will be teaching at Roots of Faith on January 16th on how to study Torah, just something very basic. So Shabbat Shalom. Have a wonderful, blessed evening. I hope you guys are enjoying some time with family and friends. And, oh, Robin and Jack, I'm so glad you're able to come. It's great to see you guys. If you missed it, I'm going to, should be there, I think, after I close the class. It takes it about maybe an hour for the class to upload. It's all handled by YouTube. I really don't do anything to it, but it'll be available throughout the week or anytime in the future. Yes, absolutely, Stephen, the legacy of Joseph. It's just so thrilling. We are all a part of this, and to be part of this Ephraim movement and to see the liberty that Jehovah has established for us. I think, what is it that Isaiah says? We cannot perceive the incredible blessing that God has for us. We can't even fathom it. It is so rich and so wonderful. So Shabbat Shalom. I'm going to go ahead and close the class down, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow morning at Roots of Faith. Have a wonderful evening.